everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to our book club. I am Miss Maka.
And I am Mr. Deril. Today we have something new for you. We have students in the audience and they are going to participate in the discussion.
წიგნის კლუბის ყველა სესიაზე გვეყოლებიან მოსწავლეები, რომლებიც აქტიურად ჩაერთვებიან ყველა დისკუსიაში.
Now today we're talking about the Hounds of the Baskervilles.
Okay, the author is Arthur Conan Doyle.
Now, Ms. Maka, it has a lot to do with ghosts and scary things.
Yeah.
I wonder, do you have a ghost story of your own?
Yes, Mr. Deril, I do have a ghost story. When I was a kid, once I was on the tree and I suddenly saw something strange. Nobody actually believes that story, but I remember that.
So no scary clowns or anything like that?
No, it was a kind of woman wearing white, something like that. But I don't know, I think no one will believe that. Let's see if people believe in the Hound of Baskerville story. So, before we look at the book itself, let's look at our agenda. The first thing that we will do is look at the vocabulary that we will need. Then we will tell you a few things about the author. After, we will talk about the book in short, so we will show you the summary of the book.
From there, we will move to the characters. It's important to know who they are. And then we have a look at the setting being the when of the story and the where of the story. And we will have a look at the main themes, which kind of answer the question, why? Like, what's the why behind the story?
Yes, and finally, of course, we have to wrap up everything and we'll talk about the conclusion. And definitely, we will have a homework for you. Yes, Mr. Deril?
I will look forward to the homework answers that come in.
Yes.
And now let's have a look at the vocabulary. We have a selection of 8 words that we think you need to focus on today. Our first word is hound. Hound. Now this is a large dog that's often used for hunting.
მონადირე ძაღლი.
Our next word is supernatural. Supernatural. This is when something can't be explained by science or by reason, and it's often abnormal.
Yes, in Georgian, it is ზებუნებრივი.
Our next word is to investigate. To investigate. This is when you examine or study or try to find something out in more detail.
გამოძიება.
From there, we move to a geographical word, moor. Moor. Now that's a wasteland, not cultivated very much, and it's land preserved for hunting.
Yes, დაჭაობებული ადგილი. სამონადირეო ნაკრძალი.
We have murderer next. It's a difficult word, so I'll say it again several times. Murderer, murderer, murderer. This is a person who kills someone on purpose.
Oh, კვლელი.
Okay, and if you are a murderer, you will probably be pursued by someone. So our next word is to pursue, pursue. This is when you follow someone in order to overtake them or capture them somehow.
Yeah, in Georgian, დადევნება.
And if you are pursued by someone, you might want to attack him back, to attack. This is when you fight someone to defend yourself.
თავდასხმა.
And our last word, going back to geography, mire, mire. And that is wild land that's a bit wet and swampy.
Oh, ჭაობი.
Okay, wow.
Now, a question from the vocabulary part. This question is for our audience. What are some synonyms for the word supernatural?
Abnormal or magical?
Well done, thank you.
Excellent.
So, now let's move on to our author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So, he was born in 1859 and died in 1930. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, so he was Scottish.
He was Scottish, but still British, I guess, because
Definitely.
of the British Isles. So he's a British writer, and he was a medical doctor by profession. He created the famous character of Sherlock Holmes in the late 19th century, so about 1887. And the first story was a study in scarlet. This was the first of 4 novels and 50 short stories, all about Sherlock and his friend Watson. But in addition to detective stories, he wrote science fiction, he wrote fantasy, he wrote plays, romances, poetry, non-fiction, historical novels.
Oh, interesting. But did you know that Doyle's attitude towards one of the most famous characters was not that positive? So he actually, in November 1891, wrote to his mother that he wanted to kill the character, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, because he actually distracted him while writing other stories. But his mother replied that you mustn't.
That's why you should always listen to your mother, I guess.
No, maybe. But you know, even to stop the company, to ask him to write more series and more stories about Sherlock Holmes, he asked for more payment. So he kind of hoped that they would say no. But to his surprise, the company agreed. So that's how he became one of the most paid authors for that time.
So we've learned 2 things. Always listen to your mother and ask for a higher salary whenever you can.
Oh, maybe.
Well, Ms. Maka, there's an interesting Georgian story. We're in Georgia. I might as well let you know. I don't know if you've known this, but
I don't know.
Mr. Conan Doyle had a son, his eldest son. He married a Georgian princess or an aristocrat. And her name was, I think, Nino Divani. And she was important enough that she was in charge of his legacy for years after he had died. So she took care of his mansion, his finances, and so on. So.
Wow, I don't really know. I didn't know this story, actually. Thank you, Mr. Derill. Now, the question for our pupils. Why do you think Mr. Conan Doyle became one of the highest paid writers of his time?
Because he created detective novels and his character Sherlock Holmes became very popular.
Oh, thank you very much.
I've got another question for our students. Do you think that Conan Doyle based the character Sherlock Holmes on any real people that he knew?
Well, I don't think so because he had some supernatural characteristic features, but nothing is excluded.
Well, I like that answer.
Yeah, me too.
Very good. Let's move on now to the summary of our story today. The summary. So, the mystery is told entirely from Dr. Watson's point of view. It's based on the local legend of a ghostly hound, from our vocabulary, that haunts the area, and the action takes place mostly at night. So you might be thinking, is this a horror story or a detective story? Well, it might be both.
Yeah.
When Sir Charles Baskerville is found dead, Holmes is called upon to protect his son, Sir Henry.
No. Okay, but what about the narrator of the story? The narrator is the assistant of Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, who is sent to Dartmoor. And Mr. Holmes remains in London because he was kind of busy for that time. But what about Mr. Watson? When he arrives in Dartmoor, he understands that the criminal is at the loose and he's free. So more unsettling events occur during this story because there is an unknown figure and nobody knows who this is, and only later Mr. Watson realizes that this is Sherlock Holmes, who has been conducting his own investigation.
Now, Holmes finds out that the killer is a fellow named Jack Stapleton, and it turns out that he is a secret Baskerville. He was one of the lost sons or relatives, cousins. Hoping to inherit the family estate, the mansion, the wealth, and everything, he plotted to kill all of his relatives, so Sir Charles, Sir Henry, and so on, using an aggressive hound that he painted with phosphorus. It's a chemical that glows in the dark, so people would think it was a ghost dog. And that was his sort of wild plan.
Oh, and did you know that superstitious Charles actually died with a heart attack when he saw the Hound of Baskerville? And Mr. Stapleton, the bad guy, also hoped to kill Henry, the heir of Mr. Charles, this way, but he was stopped by Mr. Holmes. Later, we discover that Stapleton is thought to be killed and buried in Grimpen Mire.
Very good. I've got a question about the summary now for our audience. Why do you think Holmes didn't tell Watson that he was independently working on this case?
Because he was the kind of person who didn't like to collaborate with other people.
As sometimes happens with genius type figures,
Yes,
he
they
had
want to
difficulty.
solve.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we should move on to characters now. Let's have a look at some of the individual characters of this story. And I believe the first one, why don't you do us the honors?
Okay, Mr. Derill. So yes, our first main character is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, an observant, very clever and well-known detective from 221B Baker Street. This address is very popular with tourists as well. Holmes is sometimes very egotistical, a very complex and moody. Although he has strict habits, he is very untidy. I think typical for the geniuses, right? He is also sometimes antisocial. His favorite quotation is, "When you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth."
Good advice. Our next character is Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson. And he is the narrator of the story. He is also Holmes's closest friend. Dr. John Watson performs much of the detective work. Unlike some of the other stories, he does more detective work in this story. Although he's observant, he lacks Holmes's imagination and analytical skills as well. Without a doubt, he's firmly devoted to Holmes, so he's a really good friend, and he wants to please him as well. I think he looks up to Holmes and he wants to be praised by Holmes. He's generally more sensitive to the feelings of others, whereas Holmes is a bit cold and shut off. And the reader of the book can certainly identify more with Dr. Watson than Holmes.
Yes, Mr. Derill, and definitely Dr. Watson is a really good help for Sherlock Holmes because he's a very devoted friend. Our next character is Sir Henry Baskerville, who is the nephew of the Charles Baskerville and an heir of his fortune. He shows himself to be bold, practical, and straightforward, but also impatient, hasty, and a little bit stubborn. From the beginning, he says that he's not really superstitious, but later he grows anxious over the legend.
Cool. We have Dr. Mortimer next. Now he's important for one basic reason. He's the man who hires Holmes for the case, and he lives out there with the Baskervilles on the moor. However, although he's a man of science, he is a doctor after all, he accepts the legend, the superstition of the Hound, of the ghost dog, because a lack of evidence tells him otherwise. So he follows the evidence to its ends, whereas Holmes is a little different on that score, as we'll talk about.
Oh, okay. But do you know, Mr. Derill, every story needs a bad guy of the story, and here the bad guy is Mr. Stapleton, who is a naturalist. He studies butterflies and plants on the moor. He presents himself as an eccentric scientist, but is actually the mysterious evil villain. He has used several aliases in the past, including Mr. Vandal and the once managed school. He is discovered to be a nephew of Sir Charles, and it makes him the cousin of Mr. Henry, and meaning he is therefore maybe an heir of the fortune as well.
Good. Let's wrap that section up with a question for the audience now. Now you've heard about Holmes, you've heard about Watson. Who would you rather work with if you had to investigate this case, and why?
I prefer Sherlock because he was a genius and I would learn much more from him.
It'd be easier to work with Sherlock, I think.
Yeah,
with
so-
Watson, you'd probably have to suffer a bit. You'd have to do it yourself. Maybe.
Yeah, it's really hard not to agree with you because Sherlock Holmes seems really interesting to work with.
Very clever, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Let's move on to the setting now, the setting. As you remember, we often talk about the when and the where of the story. And I'm going to talk about the when of the story. It was written when Conan Doyle was returning from the Boer War at the beginning of the 20th century, 1901, 1900, and he wrote the story then. But it's actually set about 11 years before. It's set in 1889, and we know this because at one point in the story, Holmes tells someone that he notes the date 1884, and it's 5 years prior to the story, so 1889.
Oh, interesting. But what about the where part? Where this happens? So the story starts and ends in Mr. Holmes's office, which is 221B Baker Street.
That's right.
A famous address. And the second location, there we meet Devonshire, the imposing Baskerville Hall. We also have the lonely moorlands and the Merripit house where Stapleton lives.
Very good. Now, to wrap up the setting, I'm going to ask another question to our audience. Why do you think the story happens so often in the nighttime, at night?
Probably because the author wanted to make it more frightening.
Yeah, great answer.
Yeah, definitely.
There's partially it's a horror story and partially it's a detective story. It's like a genre mash.
Yes, of course. And I am afraid of darkness, so this, of course, has
And you
bigger
have
effect.
you have seen a ghost. So
Yeah, definitely.
I would-
Don't tell anyone. No one believes me, so I don't know.
it stays with me actually.
Okay.
So, okay. We are moving on to the main themes of the story, or the why things happen in the story, why certain details were chosen in the story. We have two main themes to talk about today. And the first one is the natural versus the supernatural. So what's reasonable versus superstition in a way.
Yes.
One of the novel's primary themes is the conflict between rationalism and superstition. Much of the Hound case suggests occult explanations, but Holmes steadfastly refuses to believe any kind of superstitious reasoning. He looks for real causes.
Yes, Mr. Holmes actually represents the power of intellect. So he has good reasoning abilities. He always searches for the clues where nobody else does, actually. Holmes seeks for clues where others have not even looked. And the idea, he also looks at the case like a doctor would do, right? So first examining the symptoms and then making a conclusion, okay? So, and the idea seems to be that there is always a rational explanation. So Holmes would never take this kind of legend or mysterious hound as a real cause of the problem.
Very good. And that connects to our second theme, the power of reason. The power of reason. How does Holmes actually solve the cases? The first method, as you mentioned, was observation. He observes very carefully.
Yeah.
Second, he considers multiple possibilities at once. So he's not like fixated on one thing. He's always thinking of several possibilities all at the same time. And occasionally in the novel, he gives us hints that he considered many possibilities and dismissed them one by one.
Yes, and the problem is that some people might too quickly jump to conclusion. But what about Holmes' suggestion? He seems to be that one must first study the facts and then conduct guesswork based on it.
On that point, let's ask a few questions, maybe.
Yes, definitely.
I will start, maybe. I'm interested. How does Holmes solve his cases? You've heard us speak, but how do you think Holmes solves his cases?
He is like a doctor. He looks at the symptoms and the diagnosis, the situations. He always looks for reasons and evidences.
Excellent. That's a great answer, I think.
Yeah, that's what Holmes actually did, right? Now, what about the second question? What other creatures or kinds of people are used as ghosts in these kind of stories?
Dolls, clowns, old ladies, mostly in the movies.
Oh yes, clowns are really terrifying.
Well now, I think Ms. Maka, it is time to summarize everything we've talked about all lesson.
Yes. So as you remember, we started with the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is mostly famous with his character Sherlock Holmes.
From there, we moved to the summary of the story. We mentioned that Sherlock and Dr. Watson investigate a mysterious case of a supernatural dog or hound.
Yes. Then we talked about the characters. So where, of course, Sherlock Holmes is the main character. Next comes his friend, Dr. Watson. And in this story, Hound of Baskerville, we have Charles and Henry Baskerville and the bad guy, Mr. Stapleton.
Mm-hmm. And then we had a look at the setting, as you remember. Yeah. The time is 1889, usually at night. It deals with Baker Street in London. It deals with the Baskerville Hall, Grimpenmire, and a few other places as well.
Yes, and then we talked about the main themes, one of which was the power of reason, and the second one we had natural versus supernatural.
Okay, let's move back to vocabulary one last time. I'm going to repeat them all once just for pronunciation purposes, and I think, Ms. Maka, you can tell us the Georgian equivalent.
Definitely.
First word, hound. Hound.
Monadire dzagli.
Second word, supernatural. Supernatural.
Zebunebrivi.
Third word, to investigate. To investigate.
Gamodzieba.
Fourth word, moor. Moor.
Daჭაობებული ადგილი. Samonadireo nagrzali.
Next word, murderer. Murderer.
Mკვლელი.
Next word, to pursue. To pursue.
Dadevნება.
Next word, to attack. To attack.
Თავდასხმა.
And the last word, mire. Mire.
ჭაობი. So, Mr. Derill, let's not forget our homework. What is our homework for today?
I will tell you. We'd like a written response to the following question. Now, imagine you go for a walk on Dartmoor Moor and you encounter a hound, maybe the Baskerville hound, maybe some other hound, on your walk, and write a description of your walk and what you do about it.
Okay, now I will translate our homework into Georgian. წარმოიდგინეთ, მიდიხართ ფეხით დარტმორისკენ. გზად შემოხვდათ ბასკერვილების ნაგაზი, ან ჩვეულებრივ მონადირე ძაღლი. აღწერეთ სიტუაცია. რას მოიმოქმედებთ, როგორ მოიქცევით, შეგიძლიათ აღწეროთ ბუნება და ასე შემდეგ.
Well, I hope this was as fun for you as it was for us. I think it's time to finally say goodbye.
Yes.
Until next time.
I think that's the end of our today's session. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, the audience, for your interesting answers.
And thank you, Ms. Maka, for an interesting conversation.
And thank you very much, Mr. Derill. See you next week.
Goodbye.